Welcome everybody to the Brian Piergrossi podcast. That's me with my son Giovanni Piergrossi, a frequent guest, maybe the most frequent guest perhaps on the podcast, but he hasn't been here in a bit. So we got a lot of stuff to get into. He's excited and inspired to get into some different topics with me that he thinks will be valuable to you and be fruitful discussion for us as well. So what do we got today, Gio?
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the beauty and the value of religion and its place in the modern era. So just like a lot of stuff that we can talk about. Um, I know you recently started the circle, and that was kind of a thing to sort of create like an idea of a community, like a spiritual community, um, because a lot of people felt like there wasn't enough of that going on in the modern day, and like a lot of people were moving away from that. So I'm curious, like, if you want to explain a little bit about that, maybe for the people who like in the audience who don't know what you're doing with that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's an interesting inquiry of exploring um, how that all came together and how it comes into being. And I think of it as like how I think of most things that I do is sort of like an ongoing inquiry, you know, and um, and it's a collective ongoing inquiry, and it's an inquiry into what's happening within ourselves, what it relates with ourselves, what's happening collectively, and Um, there's a big opening that you and I've talked about that I had in this encounter with Jesus that happened a couple of years ago, an experience I had with Jesus, and I'd been on a spiritual path, a devoted spiritual path, as my highest priority for over 20 years, really, um, and had deep realizations into who I really am, in a spiritual sense and why I'm really here. And had this encounter, this experience that just sort of exploded things open to a whole other level. And in that experience, in that encounter, there was a kind of sense of like, what's happening? What is this? I don't even really understand. I don't even know. I know something incredibly powerful happened, but what exactly is this? And there were some messages that were given to me that were transmitted to me in that experience too that we can talk more about. Um, and so then I started talking with other people about it and trying to explain to them what happened to me and how this was very, really transformational for me. And I was guided to talk to certain people about it. Other people I was not guided to talk about it. And almost every single person I was guided to talk to about it, um, to my delighted surprise, told me that they had had a similar experience. So then I realized, okay, well, something's happening at large. There's some kind of, and then there was movies coming out like the Jesus Revolution. There was The Chosen. There was this whole kind of thing we could call it like a revival, right? That's happening. But then so that brings up the first question is like, are we going back to something or are we going forward to something new? Is there like this further evolution of the consciousness of the heart of Christ that's opening up into humanity? That we're moving forward to this new level? Are we going back to maybe the source point of where it all began? Um, what exactly is happening? And then I've had different revelations and realizations that um, are probably different than the average Christian, right? And then I have some that are probably the same. Um, the closest thing to my realization as far as terminology would be something like Christian mysticism, Christian non-duality, um, terms like this. Um, and so we've been kind of exploring that and discussing what's happening. And I think, for me, it's really important that these things get applied to our lives, that it's not just an abstract thing, that it's not, there's a term called spiritual bypassing, which is you get into talking about spiritual ideas to avoid facing the challenges of your life. So you could talk about, God, or you could talk about New Age concepts, or Jesus, or aliens, or, angels, or archangels, or whatever you want to talk about. And meanwhile, financially things are falling apart, your relationship's a mess, you're in horrific health. You're bordering on being homeless. You can't pay your rent. So to me, it's the most fundamental thing is like this has to change your life. It has to change your life profoundly for the better. And if it doesn't change your life profoundly for the better, I'm personally not interested. I want to see something that pragmatically and practically changes your life profoundly for the better in miraculous ways. And if it changes your life profoundly and practically for the better, miraculous ways, then it's the real deal. Then I'm interested. So this is where, one thing we can get into is how spirituality and science come together. So by the act of observation, which is the core of science, I saw that this works. So one of the things we've talked about is in the way that science brought people away from spirituality and religion. Um, I have found recently that science is actually what's bringing me closer to spirituality and the transmission of Christ and spiritual realization. So it's been an amazing journey to open up to the space and kind of feel these things that have been seen as different and separate um, coming together in the way that they are coming together right now. But that practical, pragmatic transformation, I think, is key. And I think that as you open up on this journey, you do see that, and that's my intention for the circle is that people actually make, and it is happening, really profound, powerful shifts in their life through opening to these spiritual truths together and exploring them together in a sincere, genuine way. So yeah, we meet Thursday nights live, 6 p.m. Eastern, and then it gets recorded as a podcast and on YouTube, and it gets shared there as well. We have special guests sometimes and things as well.
Nice. Yeah. So you said a lot in there. The part about the science and religion, I want to get to that, but before we dive into that, I want to also share my own like personal experience as well. Um, I've also had like an interest in Christianity for quite a while now. I think the first like person, maybe like public figure to like get me into Christianity more was like Jordan Peterson. And I started listening to a lot of Jordan Peterson like probably like maybe like 5 years ago. Like it's been like a really long time that I've been kind of diving into like the stuff that he goes into. But I found it so interesting because he would talk about the Bible in like a very like psychological, like pragmatic way. And I actually know like a lot of people who were previously like atheists who became Christians because of Jordan Peterson. Um, so I think like it's something is happening in our society where people are starting to see the practical reality of Christianity and how there's actually, it actually aligns with science. It aligns with a sort of way of living that is just healthy, that is just more aligned with, as you would say, like natural law, right?
Natural
And I would
law
say
is
the same
God's
thing.
will, and God's will is natural law.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. I would say that uh the religion, I think Christianity, particularly in the West, because it depends on where you live. Like if you live in India, if you live in Thailand or something, it's probably Buddhism that's like the religion there. But I think in the West in particular, I think there is a need to return to some sort of tradition and something that is the human I think human beings have a part of them that is inherently religious, that is inherently spiritual. And if that aspect of them is not being fulfilled, if there's nothing filling that inherently spiritual aspect of the human being, then I think it is natural for us to fall into nihilism and to fall into pessimism and to fall into a sense of despair. And that is why, Christianity has been so successful for thousands of years. and it's given hope and meaning to people, and it's given a sense of community. It's given an objective morality to follow that allows people to be kind and loving. And this is the sort of things that I started to see personally. Recently I started going to church. There's a church that's like about like 15 minutes away from me, and I started going there, and I was just amazed because the amount of welcoming that these people were, like how welcoming these people were, how loving and kind they were, and how there was such like the most beautiful thing for me was going to that church and just seeing how selfless the people were. Like how they were donating all this money, right after the hurricane happened in Western North Carolina, they were donating all this money, like tens of thousands of dollars. I remember like the last time I was there, um, the pastor was saying how there was like $40,000 or something that was raised. And I don't know if it was that church alone. It might have been a couple other churches too, but it was just amazing to me that, people who are getting nothing in return, right? These people are getting nothing in return for what they're doing. They were this generous to give this amount of money to people that are struggling, for people that are in need. And also too, like I just really felt like this spirit of compassion and community and a sense of family, seeing like children in there, families that are coming in and bringing their children, and these children are worshiping, and it's just like a beautiful thing to see. Like to me, it's something that I think our society has um moved away from. And I think there's elements like there's aspects that I think in religion that can be evolved and things that can be shifted. But I also think that there's something about religion. There's something about a grounded spirituality that is so innate to being human, that is so necessary for us as human beings. Whether you're talking about community, whether you're talking about belief in a higher power, whether you're talking about the morality that comes with that and the way we treat others and the way we treat ourselves, there is something that is so inherently valuable in religion, and I think that's something that people are realizing, and they're wanting to return to that. There's an element of groundedness that comes with religion in a world, the world that we live in today, which was hyper materialistic, hyper nihilistic, hyper atheistic, very very left brained. And when you live in a world like that, when you live in a society like that, people are looking for something. They're looking for some sort of hope, some sort of belief in goodness, in kindness, in morality, in a savior, which in the case of the Bible, that would be Jesus Christ, right? And so I think that is something that I realized, and as you were talking, like there's sort of like a revival. There's a lot of people, even like Russell Brand, for example. He was profoundly impacted because he had like a drug addiction, and having that religious experience or that religious connection helped him move out of that. So I think like for a lot of people, there is a need to return to something that is kind of inherent with being human. It's a need for just some sort of traditionalism as well, I think, because I think our society has moved away from a lot of the values that are so uh inherent to being human, things like family and things like community and things like having an actual moral compass, which I think a lot of people in the modern day, like because they don't believe in a higher power, because they don't believe in anything besides the service of the self, then there is a lack of morality. There is a lack um of belief in anything higher than I'm just here to serve myself. I'm just here to live for myself. I'm just here to get as much pleasure as possible, right? Because I think as a biological species, if you're just looking at us as like a meat sack, then yes, your main purpose is just to be as hedonistic as possible. But I think there's something more to that. There's something more to life than just living in pure hedonism and chasing materialism and trying to be as selfish as possible. I think most people deep down they have that realization, but unless you have that spiritual connection and it's a grounded spiritual connection, it's hard to really see that truth. And yeah, that was kind of my personal experience, and I think that's kind of what I'm seeing in the world right now. I'm seeing why people are returning to that. Um, but I would like to get back on this point that you were saying earlier about seeing the practical side of religion and kind of seeing the combination of science and spirituality. I don't know if you want to talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that it just became sort of undeniable that um, this profoundly changes people's lives for the better. I've seen people with one of the biggest things I would say is addiction. You mentioned addiction earlier. Um, um, it's like I call it the Christ transmission, and there's something profoundly healing and transformative in it that really it's difficult to explain it, but you can't deny the reality of it and the results of it. So as you said, like people become more kind, they become more loving, they become more caring, they become more humble, they become
Yeah,
more
I'd say humble's a big one.
they become more conscientious, you know, more in service, more dedicated to being of service, and more at peace. And that's a big thing. More at peace, more serene, more grounded, more centered. Uh, so there's all these more. I think it's a huge positive transformation in people's relationships. People become more grounded in family and marriage and children, and find the fulfillment in that, and also find the sense of service and purpose and devotion in being a father or being a mother. Yeah, there's kind of benefits across the board. I think there's some things also that I feel called to up level. So I think Christianity and health hasn't gone together for some reason. I mean, I think we can get into the reasons why. There's Christianity has a tradition of an ascetic tradition. Is that how you say it?
Yeah,
Ascetic has an
ascetic
ascetic
aesthetics. Yeah.
tradition. So it's kind of this idea of like, the body is bad, the body's the cause of sin, the body's the cause of, disconnection from God. So kind of disregard your body. But I think that while that could be of temporary value, you can do a fast for several days, or you can, go into a cave for a little while. I think the actual way forward on this path is the full integration of the body as a divine vessel, as God's creation, as the temple, and eating the foods that God gave us to eat. This is the natural law part, right? Eating the foods that God gave us to eat, the natural fruits and vegetables, and um, the the food that comes from the earth, you know. Um, so that's one part. And then just taking care of the body as far as exercise and tending to the body. I think the things to do are pretty basic. And when you actually feel basic to understand, and when you feel the actual love of your body, because when we talk about tending to this earth and being of service to the world and being of service to others and you can't do any of those things if you don't have a good body. If your body's not strong and your body's not vital and your body's not vibrant, then you're not a good vessel in this world. So you need to have a strong, clear, vibrant, vital vessel, which is your body. So really, the number one thing of all to tend to would be your body, because your body's the vessel for everything else. You know, you can't even be show up in a strong way as a husband or a father, or at your work or your business, or if you don't have a strong body to do that with. So that's something I think that's the next level. And I think that I'm seeing that happening actually all over the world, where like people who are on this path are now getting into stuff that would be considered like hippie stuff, like organic foods and homesteading and home births and um, living close to the land and living in connection with the land and really seeing the divinity in the natural world and living in community and harmony with the natural world. So there's this really really beautiful cross pollination of a lot of different things that's happening right now that's pretty exciting to be a part of. And one of the things I feel called to do, and it's happening in the coaching work I'm doing, is integrate that kind of world of like holistic wellness and physical wellness and God, So if you go to like a place where they're into holistic wellness, they generally don't talk about God. And if you go to a place where they talk about God, they generally don't talk about physical wellness. And so but it's time to kind of bring those two together and realize the integration of the two. And so the next thing I think that's interesting to talk about is we're talking about all the positive things about religion and how it's made a positive transformation in people's lives. And, to kind of look at it in a more well-rounded way, a lot of people are unhappy with religion, and a lot of people feel that it's hurt them. And a lot of people feel that it's caused them to feel a sense of shame and a sense of guilt and a sense of low self-esteem and a sense that they're not welcome and they're not invited. So I think it's an interesting exploration of like, what is that about? Why is that? What's going on there? And I'll just throw out a couple different things and then I'll get your perspective on it. One is you could say, well, that's wrong. That's not the actual teaching of Jesus. That's not the actual transmission of Christ. That's not the actual teaching of Christ. Christ was pretty almost wow. I mean, almost like a unconditionally accepting, unconditionally loving of basically he saw the divinity in everyone, regardless of what the outer external appearance was like, and regardless of what the outer external even behavior was like at the time. Because someone's behavior is transitionary based on their current level of consciousness or ignorance that they're in at the time, right? Or awareness that they're in. So he was able to see deeper than the temporary manifestation and see the divine eternal presence in each being. And I think that that's what we're called to awaken to in ourselves. That's the Christ transmission. We're called to awaken to the heart of Christ and live from this place inside ourselves. So the first thing you could say is, well, that's those are people that are imperfect and they're not actually sharing the true transmission of Christ. Second thing you could say, and I've been thinking about this, is to live in the way that Christ lives, to live in the heart of Christ, to live from this Christ transmission, to live as a child of God and express that in the world moment by moment, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's an extremely high bar. So I think there is also secondly, there is this kind of inherent sense of like, I'm not I'm not cut out for this. I'm not good enough for this. So it's like, are people making you feel bad? Or are you making yourself feel bad because you feel like you can't live up to what you're being called to? So there's kind of like, it's like, yes, you're unconditionally accepted and loved exactly as you are, 100%. And you are called to be more than you are. You are called to live to a higher standard than you're currently living. So I almost think of it as like the balance of the feminine and the masculine, right? And one of the things I really saw in the new age world, which we can get into that, because that was, even though I never really considered myself new age, I was definitely a part of that scene. And I'm still a part of that scene in some ways because I'm involved in the holistic wellness scene, which is very much new age scene. But the new age scene is more feminine oriented, and then the traditional religion is more masculine oriented. So it's kind of like the integration of the feminine and the masculine, where the feminine is you like a mother unconditionally loves her baby, exactly as the baby is and takes care of the baby regardless. Then the masculine energy sets a bar and sets a standard and is there to um I think it's fair to say to push that person, that
Guide.
child. Yeah, but I think that it's not always see people don't like the fact that this goes back to like God the Father, which is a fascinating topic to get into. So God the Father isn't always going to be gentle and soft. It's that's only half of the equation. Like God the Father could be hard on you at times, could push you, could challenge you to step into the highest and best version of yourself, to step into the fullness of who you can actually be and what you can actually be. And I think this is the part that people don't like. And this is generally people that have actual in their actual lives, they have trauma with their own fathers and they have trauma with the masculine. And this is one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot. That's like this is another thing of this kind of awakening or shift or revival or something. Something's happening majorly with the masculine now. The masculine's making a return in a way that's like pretty exciting. Um, and I don't discount when people have had trauma with the masculine and trauma with the father. There's legitimate reasons for that. I mean, I think that the pain people have had is because they don't feel like it's a father that's truly been loving, and truly had their best interests and truly been of service. Maybe there was a sense of this father that was self-centered or was just trying to, like you were talking about, hedonistic for their own self indulgence without being aware of the care and service of the whole, right? But in any case, whether it's valid or not, there does need to be a father. There needs to be a mother, and there needs to be a father. And I think this return of the father is part of the equation of what's being called for. So a lot of different things there, but I will turn it over to you to whatever part you want to piggyback off of.
Yeah, so first I want to start with the whole health thing. Um, One thing I find interesting is like, and I'm sure you've probably noticed this more than me because you technically, I mean, I don't know, you could say you weren't a hippie or you weren't part of the hippie community, but I think technically like that used to be a community that like you were in, and I see this like what would you call it? Like a funnel from like the hippie community to like the Christian community. And I see like people bringing good elements from that community, which you, as you said, is like the holistic living, the homesteading, the kind of like because like I think with the hippie community, you had elements that were good. You had elements that were focused on holistic living. You had elements that were focused on eating healthy, caring about the body, getting back in tune with nature, right? There was elements that were good, but then also there was a lot of, I think, ungroundedness. And I think especially in like the new age spirituality that came along with the hippies, like for example, like I think a lot of hippies took like Buddhism and they kind of made it this like hedonistic, like self-serving, I can do whatever I want type of religion. And actually Buddhism is like when you look at traditional Buddhism, it's actually very similar to Christianity in a lot of ways. Like there's a lot of strict rules. There's a lot of ideas of what's right and wrong. There's a lot of focus on uh, being selfless and caring for other people and all these different things, right? So I think a lot of people took, uh, like a foreign religion that they weren't used to and kind of made it into their own thing, their own kind of like self-serving belief system. And I think that it became a very ungrounded spirituality, and a lot of other things came in. Like I think there was some like occult stuff that got it mixed in with it, and some uh, you know, I don't know, some esoteric stuff. Whatever the case is, like it was just I feel like the new age, there's so much like ungroundedness, and there's so much like there's such a lack of like clear direction and moral guidance in the way people can live. And I think the difference of Christianity is that it actually gives people like a pathway, like in the Bible, it talks about the narrow path, right? And Jesus talks about what is right, what is wrong. Like he gives an idea of morality in the Bible. He talks about if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, then you're committing adultery. Like you're objectifying a woman when you look at her in that way, right? And there's other things too where he talks about, like not being so materialistic, not focusing on the world so much and trying to hoard all this material wealth for yourself or not being a hypocrite, like not when he talks to the Pharisees, and he's like, don't pray where people can see you, pray where no one can see you, and only where God the Father can see you. So there's a lot of values that I think Jesus teaches, and that in the Bible as a whole, I think a lot of people are more turned off by the Old Testament. But even in the Old Testament, there's a lot of really good values. There's a lot of really good lessons and things. And I think when you look at people who are Christian, whether they were raised up Christian or maybe they came to Christianity later in their life, you see that people who are not like lost, like they don't really seem like they're lost, Like I think in the new age, a lot of people seem like they're lost and they're always searching for something. They're always like, oh, I need to do this new thing and I need to learn this new thing about astrology or whatever, right? It's like it's always like this new thing that people need. There's always this searching, and every time you're searching, it's like you never truly find the truth. Like you never truly find anything that is deeply fulfilling, right? And never there's always like a further that you need to go, right? But I see with Christians is that it seems like they've already found the truth. They're already grounded in something. They don't have to search for anything else because they're already fulfilled. They've already found the truth. They've already know what they have to do in their life. They know how they have to live, right? And I think that is the difference with, a lot of the people who are in the New Age hippie community and Christians, right? But as I've said, like there are elements I think that you were talking about, which is when it comes down to holistic living, when it comes down to the focus on health. Um, one thing I thought of too when you said that is I do think Christianity, like I think there needs to be more of a focus. Um, there needs to be more of an integration with health and Christianity and like a more grounded religion, right? But I also think too that there is elements of Christianity that relate to health that people don't really acknowledge, right? Because like one thing, for example, and I think about this personally, right? Within like the like fitness and health community, you have a lot of people who are very vain. Like they're extremely vain to the point where it actually is a detriment because they're so obsessed with their appearance. They're so obsessed of having a certain body weight, and this was a problem that I dealt with. And this is why like it relates personally to me because especially when I was in undergrad and university, I was very focused on my body image. I was very focused on having like a perfect body, having a six pack, being chiseled and all this stuff. And I looked really good. Like I was probably one of the best looking guys in my university. Um, but at the same time, like it wasn't really fulfilling and it wasn't really like I don't think that that is truly what health is. I don't think health is fitting some body standard and being obsessed with your appearance. And I think Christianity, there actually is uh, a kind of an idea that vanity is wrong. Like being extremely obsessed with your appearance, being extremely obsessed with anything that just relates to you, like it's wrong to be extremely vain, right? And I think there's value in that because vanity not only is bad for yourself in the sense that you're kind of obsessed with yourself, you're kind of obsessed with every flaw in your being, everything you do, especially in terms of your appearance, in terms of these materialistic things that don't really are not really truly valuable. When you have an obsession with those things, it can be mentally unhealthy. But also it can be healthy in a broader scale. And this is what I want to get to later, because I think the core of Christianity, in my opinion, is love, right? But when people talk about love, it's not just love for other people, it's also love for yourself as well. So I think the core of Christianity is having love for yourself and other people. And that love is coming from an external place. Um, you're sourcing that love from God, right? So I think that is the key of Christianity. And it's why a lot of people have a problem with, you were talking about the issues with Christianity and some of the reasons why people leave. A lot of people have church hurt and a lot of people have a lot of shame and guilt. And there's also this kind of idea. I feel like a lot of people have this feeling that they're being constrained when they're in Christianity. And I think there are people who are Christian who take it very seriously, go to church, pray, read the Bible, they were baptized, all these things, right? And they actually are very mentally healthy. Like they actually are more psychologically healthy than the majority of the population. And I would actually say for most people in religion, like if you look up studies of religious people versus, atheists or people who aren't religious, you will see that these people are mentally, more mentally healthy. Now, it's not to say that there are people who do have, there are some issues I think need to be addressed within, the Christian community. And, there are things that can be integrated with Christianity, but nonetheless, if you just look at it from, a broad perspective, you will see that a lot of people are, and this is not just for Christianity, for religion in general, right? Whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Judaism, whether it's Islam, whatever the case is, people who are more religious tend to be more mentally healthier. They tend to have, and I think there's a lot of reasons why that is, but I think, community, I think a sense of purpose, right? When people don't have a sense of purpose,
There's
it
a whole
can lead to
bunch of
nihilism.
scientific studies that support that, right?
Yeah, that's what I said earlier. There's tons of scientific data to support that. And also too, like there's data to support that having a sense of meaning and having a sense of purpose allows for people to be more psychologically healthy, right? Because I think the reason why Jordan Peterson, for example, is so popular is because he always talks about nihilism and how there's a crisis in society where people are nihilistic. If you're an atheist, you don't believe in any higher power. You don't believe in any higher sense of morality. You don't believe in any ultimate, like Christianity has this very like eschatological or esca I don't know if I'm saying it right, but it has this whole eschatology where it's like, Jesus came to save humanity from sin, and he's going to come back and he's going to basically bring justice back to earth, and the righteous will be rewarded in heaven and all these things, right? So like there's this whole like story. Like I think what a lot of people are missing in their lives is story, right? Because when you read the Bible, it's filled with all these stories that teach moral lessons. It's filled with all these stories that give a sense of meaning, a sense of guidance, a sense of purpose, right? And I think the issue with things like the New Age or atheism is that there's no like archetypes. There's no stories that are bring humanity into the way that these people are living, right? Because the Bible has so many uh stories, like even just the story of Jesus alone in itself, right? Even just like the New Testament story, but particularly the story of Jesus and the resurrection, and even that alone has a lot of moral value. It has a lot of archetypal value, right? Because you have people like Carl Jung and all this who talk about archetypes and all this, right? But it's like our society has mo moved so far away from the idea of archetypes and symbolism and having value in stories, right? Because human beings have been, even from the most primal times, right? When we would just sit, we were just tribes, in an African savannah, and we would sit around, a fire, right? Even at those times, like people were telling stories, right? Stories were like, most of the Bible before it was written down, it was passed orally. So a lot of people, I think, like the reason why there's so much nihilism, the reason why there's so much there's such a lack of purpose, there's such a lack of meaning, is because we're missing this very human aspect of living,
Can
which
you
is
pause? Can you
having
pause for a
stories.
moment?
Yeah.
So the problem is the problem or the apparent problem or what people think is the problem is science, right? So science, so yeah, so you go back historically, we'd sit around the fire, we'd have these amazing stories, we would be storytellers. That would be what we were. We were storytellers. We tell these stories and we pass down these stories that would have inherent lessons in them, and have inherent values that would be transmitted from generation to generation. And these stories would be a framework in which people would live their lives, right? So then science comes in, quote unquote science. I mean, science, the act of observation always existed, but all of a sudden there's this thing called science, which basically it becomes like a new religion. We call it scientism. So
Yeah.
science comes in and goes, well, those are cute stories, but they're not true. So why are you telling stories that aren't true? And then science comes in and says, well, meaning, well, there is no, that we can't prove that there's any meaning. So if we can't prove it, then it's not true. So basically, it becomes this idea that like if you can't observe it in the material world, if you can't observe the pattern, then in the with your five senses, that it's not true. So then everything, the whole spiritual domain just falls away as being false. With what I would say is an incorrect assertion that if you can't observe something with your five senses, it's not true. It just doesn't mean it's not true. It just means you can't observe it with your five senses, right? So I think we have to bring that's where the nihilism, the atheism, and quite honestly, like depression and anxiety, most of these things have come from people who are very materialist atheists, very materialist scientists, and I know this from my working, the work I do with lots of people. I work with people that are atheists, people that are spiritual people, not to say, I think again, people that are there's a kind of fundamental religion that has its own problems, you know. So those people have a lot of fear, have a lot of anxiety, have a lot of they also have it. But I think what's happened is like science and scientism in particular has become its own fundamental religion. And this is where the extreme level goes into this, the woke stuff, which it's almost like now they have created narratives that um, don't, let's just say they don't really work as far as being grounded, as far as being centered, as far as being in a sense of fulfillment and wholeness and empowerment and being able to take responsibility for your life and move into a life of fulfillment and well-being. Um, so I think that's where things took this interesting detour historically, and now we're people like you and I, others, John Vervaeke's interesting. There's a bunch of people that are really interesting that are kind of exploring this question of like, what happened with this science thing that put us in this horrific, you know, disconnected state spiritually? Does that need to be the case? Can't we have an integration of science and spirituality and religion? So I think that's the question that people are exploring right now. And the answer is yes, we can. And we're exploring, I think what that looks like together. Because in the same way that science is the exploration of truth in the material world, spirituality and religion is at its essence is designed to be the exploration of truth in the non-material world.
Right. And I think it's good you made that distinction between science and scientism because I think religion and spirituality, you could say that that's the exploration of the spiritual reality or that's the exploration of like the soul or whatever, right? But I'd also say that like science actually, and you were saying this earlier, right? Science actually backs up religion. Like it actually proves, like if again, like we were talking about like different studies and stuff, right? But in terms of like just like human thriving, right? In terms of like humans thriving, right? And humans living to their ultimate potential and humans being fulfilled, right? Science points to religion being part of that, right? If you look at like the blue zones, for example, right? All the blue zones have an idea of some sort of communal religion, right? And these are places in the world where people live past 100, right? If you look at, studies on mental health, like people have better mental health outcomes if they are religious. If you look at, um, and people who are married longer, right? People who have better, more fulfilling relationships. Those studies also show that people who are religious have more fulfilling relationships. They have longer lasting marriages, right? So like a lot of things scientifically point to religion, and you can say spirituality being in alignment with thriving as a human being, with having fulfillment, right? And it definitely does not point to atheism, right? Because atheism, again, like I think a lot of people who are atheistic, right? You do have different types of atheists, and it's not, I don't want to group all atheists together. There are atheists that are very happy and they have very fulfilling relationships and et cetera, right? But I would say on average, a lot of atheists tend to be nihilistic. And I think that that leads to a lot of issues. I think morally, people who are atheistic, a lot of them believe in a sort of subjective morality, and that kind of can lead to a sense of like unclearness and how they should morally act in different situations. Like for example, I was listening to this debate. It might have been an atheist Christian debate. I don't know what it was, but it was some sort of discussion on religion. And I remember the person they were talking about, if you see like a grandmother and she's like struggling to cross the street, right? And you go to help that grandmother, are you doing it because you have an actual like reason to help her? Like there's actually a selfless purpose for you to help her, or are you just doing it to help yourself, right? Are you just doing it because like, oh yeah, it'll make me feel better, or it will, um, I don't know, like somebody will see it and I'll look like a hero or something like that, right? So it's like a lot of these deep moral questions, like when you take away, I think, the moral fabric of society and people stop believing in a higher power, they stop believing in a sense of a higher moral purpose, right? It can lead to a lot of consequences. I think not only morally, but I think, in terms of mental health and in terms of, a lack. I think another problem that people are dealing with today is isolation. I think a lot of people are lonely. A lot of people feel isolated. A lot of people are in a lot of toxic relationships, especially in my generation, that's the case. And I think that because of that, people are looking for something to come to that does give community, that does give not only community, but healthy community, right? Because there are a lot of things that give community, but it's not healthy community. The people don't treat each other well. The people don't, they're not selfless, right? They're not supportive of each other. So I think the difference with religion is like if you go to a church, there are churches that are not that great, right? But I think on average, I think the more healthier Christian churches, um, if you go to those churches, you'll be welcomed and you'll be accepted and you'll be given a sense of community and you'll be supported. Whether, I think in Christianity, there's this deep, profound sense of selflessness and this deep, profound sense of helping. Jesus, when Jesus came, he said, I came for the meek. Like the meek will inherit the earth. I came for the downtrodden. I came for the people who are not the people like in a societal lens, right? In the lens of society, these are not the people who are usually treated well. These are not the people who are usually valued in our society, right? Usually it's the people who have money, who have power, who have status, who have good looks, whatever the case is, right? But when Jesus came, he said, "No, I didn't come for those people. I came for the people who have nothing. I came for the people who are homeless. I came for the people who you know, are poor in spirit, who have feel like there's nothing left in their life to live for, right? And that's a really beautiful thing when you think about it, because that is the exact moral system that these people are living with, right? They're following Jesus as a moral teacher, and he he literally taught that, basically when you look at human nature, when you look at evolution, right? It's usually survival of the fittest. It's usually might is right. Like that is usually, when you go out and you look at nature, you see, a fox killing a deer or something, and there's no sympathy, there's no empathy there, right? It's just kind of how human nature is. A shark is the top of the food chain, and it's going to eat all these fish, right? And so, and even with humans, like a lot of times might is right with humans, right? Like if you have power and you have a certain ideology and you have, the right weaponry and stuff, you can take over an entire nation and you can spread that ideology, right? Think of people like Hitler, right, who had the power he needed to have to do all the atrocities that he did, right? So in a way, if you just look at like just the basic nature of the way the world works, it is kind of that like might is right. It is kind of that, if you have power, then you can get whatever you want, right? But I think the element that Christianity brings is it gives this sense that people have a moral imperative to help people who are in need, to kind of shift almost this sort of what seems like a natural moral system, which is just might is right, and to flip that on its head, and instead, actually, humility is right. Actually, being selfless is right. Actually, as you were saying, there is sort of this also ascetic portion of Christianity, which I think, for some people, I think for the majority of people, it's probably a little too much, but I think there is something beautiful about that too. Even with Buddhism, I think there's something beautiful about that ascetic way of living where people are able to turn away from materialism and turn away from these things because when you have that sort of extreme moral imperative to turn away from like worldly materialistic things, I think it's easier for other people to also do that, maybe in a lesser way, but to not be as selfish, to not be as materialistic, to not be as self-serving and greedy and trying to get their own gratification, their own pleasure at the expense of other people. When you have something, a higher belief in something, and you have a person, and I think Jesus is as many would say, all divine and human, right? But when you have a figure like Jesus who came down and he lived this very selfless life and he had this element of sacrifice, right? um, it leads to people living a way that it almost seems contrary to nature. It almost seems like it's unnatural. But at the same time, there is something so beautiful about it. There's something so amazing about it. And I think that is exactly what people are looking for in the modern day. I think that's exactly what people are seeing in Christianity. And I'm going to let you talk, but I just want to say this last point. Um, there was I don't know if you remember this guy's name, but he was like an Orthodox priest, and I think he's like a Syrian, and I can't remember the exact guy's name, but he's like pretty famous, like very like masculine priest, like long beard and everything, Orthodox priest. And this is one of the things that really attracted me to Christianity because I remember this particularly. And what happened is that this guy, again, I can't remember exactly. I think it's like in Assyria or something, or some place near the Middle East, right? He was doing a sermon or whatever during like mass, or I don't know what branch of Orthodoxy it is. I don't know like the exact tenets of their belief system, but basically, he was at church and he was talking, and what happened is that this guy who was like an Islamic extremist actually went up and basically like stabbed him in the eye, right? And it was this whole thing, and it was all over the news, and everyone was talking about it because this guy was like a really famous Orthodox priest, and he was very famous online, right? And so after he got stabbed in the eye and like he, went to the hospital, because actually what happened is that a lot of the people from his church actually were like retaliating and they were getting mad and they were trying to fight like the Muslims that are in the area. And this is the part where it was extremely beautiful for me because what happened is that after he recovered from from that injury, he said, and he was speaking specifically to the guy who did this to him, right? And he's like, I love you and I forgive you. And he actually called him my son. He's like, my son, I forgive you, I love you, I care for you. And it was so beautiful to me. Like it was such an amazing thing that this man who something so like terrible happened to him, like somebody who had so much hate in their heart, somebody who had so much um you know had so much vengeance, and believed in because obviously, like you said, with religion there can be problems, right? So I think in Islam, there are people who are extremists, right? And they do believe, I gotta do this for my religion, I gotta hurt people, right? So it was really beautiful to me that this guy was so forgiving and he was so loving to somebody that literally almost killed him, right? That was something that made me see that like a lot of people, I think they lose hope and they look at humanity and they get very pessimistic and they get very I can't think of the word, but people become very hateful towards human beings because they've experienced so much injustice in their life. They experience so much pain from other people, and they become very pessimistic. They become very hopeless. They become very hateful of humanity. And I think when you see things like that, and you see the culture that it comes from, and you see the fact that it comes from this kind of Christian ethos, right? It is very attractive to me. It's very it really draws me towards the Christian faith in a way that other things don't, because I don't really see people acting like that outside of believing in a higher power and believing in a source of love and a source of goodness, a source of forgiveness, right? I think that was the main teaching from Jesus, was forgiveness, right? The main teaching from Jesus was sacrifice and forgiveness, and those are two very selfless things, because most people do not want to sacrifice. Most people do not want to forgive. If somebody has hurt them, they usually want to get vengeance. They usually are filled with anger. They usually are filled with resentment, right? And that's the case for me. Like, I'm a very emotional person. It's easy for me to get angry. It's easier for me to get resentful and vengeful, right? And I think for a lot of people, that's also the case. But when you believe in a source of forgiveness, a source of of unconditional love, when you believe in a source of truly being selfless and truly having an idea of sacrifice, right? Because I think that's the core tenet of Christianity at the end of the day, of what Jesus did was sacrifice, right? When you believe in sacrifice for a higher good, you're sacrificing um your whole, because Jesus died in a very terrible, torturous way, right? And he did that for in the Christian story, it was for all of humanity, right? And so when people are living in that framework, there is a sense that, like, hey, maybe I'm not the most important thing. Maybe there's a higher good that I'm called to. There's a higher purpose that I'm called to, and that involves sacrifice and forgiveness and love for other people. I think that's the beauty of Christianity, at least that I've seen,
Hmm. I think that one thing that's interesting to touch on is the the spiritual but not religious movement and what that's about and why that exists and kind of how you see that and uh yeah, just want to get your take on the I'm spiritual but I'm not religious.
Well, can you explain more? Because I think that's when people say they're spiritual, it's like a very like broad, it can mean like technically anything. So
Well, I
like
think
maybe
that's just it. I think that's what I'm saying is like it's very broad. So it's like I'm spiritual. What does that mean? I don't know what it means, but that's what they say. I'm
well, I
spiritual,
think
but I'm not religious. I mean, to be honest, that's something that I would have said, and probably I would even say now. So maybe I should think about what I mean by it. So I
yeah.
think that there's the dogmatic component of religion. There's and then there's like the what people call the legalism of religion. So there's like the codes, follow the codes. There's the laws, follow the laws. There's the commandments, follow the commandments. There's the dogma, repeat the dogma, you know, and then oh, I'm religious. I'm a good person.
Mhm.
But if you're just doing that, it's something that's like dead. It doesn't have any kind of life force. It's not alive. It's not living. You're not drinking from the living waters. This is something we talk about a lot in the circle. It's like you're not drinking from the living waters if you're just going through the motions. I mean, we didn't even mention like the rituals, repeating the rituals, repeating the rituals, repeating the rituals, the sacraments, repeating the sacraments, repeating the sacraments. Um, but there's something that is alive that is like an explosion of infinite love, you know,
Mhm.
that is at the source point of all creation and permeates all things. And so to me, this is like I wouldn't necessarily say the term that I would use would be the mystical path, which actually has its through line through religion, but also outside of religion. Um, and that is the relationship. Um, it's like the desire, the intention, and the fulfillment of union with Christ, union with God, that you are not separate or not in division with God and with Christ. And the ultimate, it's kind of like a paradox because the ultimate intention is to be in union with God and union with Christ. And Orthodox Christianity, they call it theosis, is the term. But then also this realization that you actually are, that's actually is the case right now. So this is kind of like my message that came through in this experience with Jesus is that we actually are in union with God and we are in union with Christ. And that is our natural essence and it is our natural nature. And then we're called to live from that truth and to live from the awareness of that truth and also to live from the awareness of seeing that divinity in everyone that we interact with and in our relationship with.
Yeah. So a couple of things came to mind when you were saying that. First thing I think is that I think the true heart of Christianity, it's not religion. And I know I'm using that term because I'm trying to maybe distinguish between like the New Age and kind of this very loose spirituality that people have. Um, but I do think that the heart of Christianity is not religion. And I think when Jesus came, he actually came to get rid of religion. Because what you had was you had people like the Pharisees where they were very focused on like an external, like, as you were saying, like legalistic way of doing things. And basically what Jesus said is like, you do all these rituals, you do all these things, especially when you look at like older forms of Judaism, it's like very, very like ritualistic. Like more ritualistic than like Catholicism, like any religions. When you look at like the very old Judaism, it's like super like there's all these like very specific things you have to do, very specific rituals you have to do, right? And again, nothing against Judaism, but I'm just kind of explaining something here. And so I think when Jesus came, and he saw like the Pharisees and he saw all these people where they were doing all these rituals, but their hearts were not pure. And I think that's actually a specific verse where he says like you do all these external things. You do all these things to look like you're clean on the outside. You do all these things to um all these rituals that are kind of just going through the motions. But inside you're not pure. Inside you're not refined. Inside there's not a true connection to God on internally. And I think that's the difference is that there is like an external religion or like kind of uh ritualistic way of living, which is like it's very empty. It's very routine, mundane. And then there's an internal experience. And I want to use that word experience particularly. There's a more experiential form of Christianity that actually is a communion with God. And it's not this like, oh, I'm gonna follow like a rule book and have no connection and just do what I have to do because so and so tells me to do it, and because my church tells me to do it, and because it's actually like it's coming from a place of actually like wanting to do those things, not from a place of like restriction and like feeling trapped and feeling forced, but from a place of like this is the right thing, and I'm doing this because of love, and I'm doing this because
You
of
said it's a relationship.
yeah, yeah, relationship. Yeah, I think that's the difference because and this is something I've heard a lot of Christians say. Like I've heard a lot of Christians that I think the ones who tend to be, the ones who are not as dogmatic and not as caught up in like this very judgmental or like very like like old school like ritualistic way of thinking. A lot of them will say like Christianity is about a relationship with Jesus. It's not about following a rule book or religion. It's about a relationship. And I've heard this so much. Like I've heard a lot of Christians say this, where at the end of the day, like religion is not truly Christianity. And like when you actually read the Bible, like I've been reading like the Gospels. I've been reading um, just the New Testament. And it doesn't like to me, it doesn't seem like it's talking about religion. It seems like it's talking about a relationship. Even like Paul talks a lot about the gifts of the Spirit and the Holy Spirit. And
Well,
um,
it's important now is that Jesus was not a Christian.
well, yeah, I mean, he wasn't. I mean, even the term Christian came later. I think you were the one who originally told me this, but the first Christians, they were called the Way or something like that,
The
which I
followers
think
of
is
the
like
way. It was called they were
Yeah.
the followers of the way. Yeah, which yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and I actually looked that up and it's true. Like that was actually so I think like that's something that's pretty interesting because I think a lot of people when they look at Christianity and they look at the history of Christianity, they see a lot of things like the Catholic Church and how there was this whole like power structure and like again like we were talking about some of the negatives within like religion or within um the kind of dogmatic Christian religion. I think when you look at history, there are a lot of atrocities that happen. There are a lot of, even with the Protestant Reformation, you have Martin Luther where he's talking about how there was so much corruption in the Catholic Church. And I think that's why you had like the Protestants and stuff like that, right? Because I think what happened is that, humans are going to be humans, right? And if you have somebody like Jesus who is like connected to the divine and brings these like super high consciousness ways of being and ways of thinking and a way of living that kind of transcends like this very like materialistic worldly way of living as a human, of course you're going to have people who change that and twist it and use it for their own power and their own greed and their own selfishness. And I think that is exactly what you see within Christianity is like the sort of corruption that happens and the sort of the negative side of religion, as you would say, it comes from not God or not like Jesus, but it comes from, the kind of darker side of living as a human being. Like in Christianity, they talk about Satan and they talk about demons and stuff like that, right? Um, and I think that that's an interesting thing as well, if you want to like talk about that. But I also think there's an element to just being human where, and this is something that's a little bit controversial. Maybe we can talk about this too, because I'm curious what you think. But in the Bible, it kind of talks about how there's a such thing as like original sin, and humans kind of have like a wicked heart, right? And to me, the original sin thing, I'm a little bit iffy on, but I think when the Bible talks about people having a heart that is wicked and it's drawn towards wickedness, I actually kind of believe that because when I see the world, when I see people who don't have like a higher sense of morality, a higher sense of good, I think people are sort of more naturally selfish. And I think the world, like when we look at the world, especially nowadays in like the hyper like capitalistic, materialistic, very superficial with like social media and all these things, like I think it's easy for people to be more focused on materialism and selfishness if they don't have that deeper rooted spiritual connection. And I think with Christianity, it can be something that's very grounding in that because again, with things like the New Age and things like these very loose like spiritual belief systems, it can be easily twisted. It can be easily turned because like when you have like a structured religion like Christianity or even something like Buddhism, it's like there's a very like clear way of living. Is it, you're supposed to not live within the world. You're supposed to be selfless. You're supposed to do these things. Whether it's in Buddhism, it's bad karma, or whether in Christianity it's a sin. Whatever the case is, in Islam it's haram. Whatever the case is, right? Um, in all these different religions, like there's a clear idea of right and wrong. There's a clear idea of how you should live as a human being. And I think with these very loose, like spiritual paths, I don't know if there is as clear of a way. And I think it's not to say like that these things are bad and that all spiritualities outside of like a mainstream Christianity is wrong. But I think there needs to be some sort of integration that allows for a more grounded spirituality. Because I think with a lot of the new age and all these things, it's very ungrounded. And I think that's the reason why so many people are returning to more of a Christian version of spirituality because they realize like where is the focus on, selflessness and the lack of like I think a big thing is humility, right? Like where is the humility, right? Because like the main story in the Bible, like the so-called fall of humanity dealt with humility. It dealt with vanity, right? Because like when Adam and Eve were in the garden and you know God said, do not eat from the tree of good and evil or whatever, right? Basically what he was saying is like, like you don't need to become gods. You don't need to become your own god. Like there's already a god. There's already a way of living. Uh there's already a moral system that you can follow, and you don't need to create your own way. And I think that's the problem with so many people is like they think that like they can figure everything else out on their own, and they can be their own god, and they can have their own moral system. And I think that is where a lot of people go wrong in the new age and this kind of very loose spirituality, because what happens is that a lot of people end up becoming selfish. A lot of people end up hurting other people, and they end up getting hurt because they're in a community that does not prioritize a higher moral system, that does not prioritize a grounded spirituality that is rooted in actual morality, but also is rooted in, a figure like Jesus, who was, in the Christian in the Christian ethos was the biggest example, the pure, he was seen as sinless, and he was seen as the divine in human form. So like when you have something like that, it is so much different than just, oh, I can do what I want, and I can be my own God, and I can, choose my own pathway and stuff, right? I think unfortunately something like that allows for the darker side of humanity, the aspect of humanity that is farther away from light, that is farther away from justice and goodness, and it can allow that aspect of the human being to corrupt the good elements, right? Because I think at the end of the day, one of the most important things, regardless of what religion you're talking about, is humility, right? I think humility is something, again, in the Christian story, it's one of the main things, right? With the story of Adam and Eve, right? Um, the fall happened when, Adam and Eve thought that they could be their own gods, and they could, figure out things on their own, and they don't need some higher moral system. So I think that is something that I think, again, I think there's good elements to kind of the, as you were saying, like spiritual path. But I also think that part of the reason why people are seeking Christianity, or seeking something that's more grounded, is because a lot of times those very loose spiritual paths don't provide that higher sense of morality, don't provide that higher sense that allows for humility, that allows for surrender, right? Surrendering to something higher than yourself. And that is kind of what I see, at least in my perspective, with spirituality and sort of the more traditional Christianity, I guess.
To me, it's at the core, it's very simple. Not to say it's necessarily easy to live it, but the understanding of it's very simple. So if you want to use the term darkness and the light, right? So to live in the darkness is not enjoyable for any sustained period of time. And so this is where spirituality and science comes together again, because it practically, pragmatically, to live in the darkness doesn't work. So you living in the light is enjoyable for a sustainable period of time, and it works. So practically and pragmatically, it works. So through trial and error, my contention is you will realize that the living in the light is better than living in the dark. You'll recognize what is of the light, you'll recognize what is of the dark, and you will naturally gravitate towards living in the light because it's more enjoyable over a sustained period of time, where living in the darkness is not.
I don't know if I entirely agree. I do think that a lot of times for people it can be evident, like the right way to live, but I don't think people naturally gravitate towards that. I think there's a lot of people where they live lives where they cause a lot of pain for other people, and they actually don't recognize the pain that they're causing. And for some people, it's actually enjoyable. For some people, it's actually they might get a thrill with, maybe not necessarily like consciously hurting people, but maybe they don't recognize how much they are hurting people or how in their relationships they're being selfish or they're being um, self-serving in a way. And I think um again, like I think people probably to a degree, there's something within like the human soul or the spirit that recognizes like, hey, maybe this isn't the right path. Maybe I need to like change a couple things here. But I don't necessarily think that like I think that some people are okay with walking that darker path. And that's why you have people in the world, I could give various names, but you just have evil people, right? You have people that commit atrocities and you have people that do
So
terrible
do you think that
things.
those people are enjoying their life in a sustainable way?
I
Like,
don't know
do
if
they seem like relaxed and at peace and serene and in a great deep sense of love, and communion and, you know, inner freedom and contentment?
yeah, maybe this is where you kind of draw the line between because you were saying the spiritual and the kind of material earlier. I think this is kind of where you draw that line because there is a sort of gratification, like a short-term gratification that let's
Short
just take
term,
like let's
very
just
short
take like
term,
somebody who's like a drug addict, right? Like there's this short-term gratification that you get. Like you get all this dopamine in
like
your brain and
heroin.
so heroin, yeah, right. Like I remember somebody actually this is interesting actually, but I was watching this video about like what the actual experience is of somebody who does heroin. And the guy was saying that it feels like you're putting on God's blanket, which is kind of crazy, but it's not a spiritual feeling. It's just a physiological like pleasurable feeling, right? It's like if you were to like multiply the pleasure of having an orgasm like times 500 or something, that would be like what it is like taking heroin, right? So I think like for somebody like that, right? Like there's physiologically and like and in the short term, you're getting this like huge dopamine boost and you're getting this like uh this pleasure, that's coming instantly, right? And that's the same thing with sex. It's the same thing with a lot of things in the world, even with junk food or like playing a video game or I don't know, going to a casino or something like that, right? There's a lot of things in the world that give you this like short-term gratification. Um, but I think there's something like
But
spiritually.
let's pause a second, because you're only going to chase the heroin addict is the perfect example. You're only going to chase this temporary joy if you're currently in pain.
Yeah, I don't know if I would necessarily use the word pain, but I think I would use the word like a lack of fulfillment and a
Well, my
lack of.
understanding of, heroin addicts is that they're in intense pain, like the most intense pain. And once they get the heroin um, fix, there's a temporary moment of joy, but the moment of joy is really ends up at some point just being the relief, temporary relief of the pain. And then the pain commences again. And I think it's pretty much that way with whatever whatever example you want to give. Any kind, you mentioned sex. So if it was like someone had a very severe sex addiction, it'd be the same thing. Or whatever the example you want to give, this is someone who's actually in a deep sense of pain, gets a temporary relief by chasing this thing, and then they're in the intense sense of pain again. So I think what you realize is that instead of chasing the temporary joy, or with the grace of God, you realize that instead of chasing the temporary joy and then being in a state of pain, intense pain the rest of the time, it's possible to have eternal joy. That's that's the good news that actually Jesus actually came to share. That it's possible to have eternal joy, and that joy is accessible right now. And it's not a joy, it's a spiritual joy. It's not a joy of the hormones. It's not a joy of the it's something that's on the soul level of the soul, the spiritual level. And it's like a deeper resting in the realization of who we really are and why we're here.
Yeah, that was what I was ultimately trying to say is that I think that distinction is important because like I think a lot of people get so caught up in how do I fulfill like the body or how do I fulfill like the urges or the material uh pleasures or just like people are so caught up in like the body, right? And again, like obviously as you were saying earlier, like there is importance in the body, there's importance in health, but I think when people get so focused on the body and they get so focused on pleasure and gratification and things like this, and it can become something that leads to a lack of fulfillment because what happens is that you're focused on the temporary instead of the long term. You're focused on the material instead of the spiritual. You're focused on, as you were saying, like the transient instead of the eternal, right? So I think like for a lot of people, they get so focused on, and I think that's a thing about Christianity that I like is that there is this idea that like, some people would say it's ascetic, right? But there is this idea that like, you know, um, there's something higher than just the material. There's something higher than just the body. There's something higher than just the world, right? And obviously you can take that to an extreme where you neglect the body or you shame the body or you have guilt about the body, right? But also it can take you to a place that is very healthy and that takes you away from I think a lot of people, and this is even the case in Buddhism, right? Like in Buddhism, it talks about how like a lot of suffering is caused by you know, um, wanting things and desire, right? And like the main teaching of Buddhism is like to basically extinguish desire and to be content with the present moment, right? Or to sort of re reach nirvana, right? And I think in Christianity you have something similar, especially in the New Testament, where it's basically like being content with God, right? Being content with, um, you know, sort of having this deeper spiritual relationship that is reliant not on, short-term selfish gratification, but on serving others and on living a life that is, um, very disciplined,
And
right?
also
Um,
not on your own egoic will.
yeah, exactly. Like
There's a
not,
contentment with God's will, God's plan.
yeah, I would say, yeah, that's also another thing too, because again, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about like the kind of loose spirituality a lot of people have. It's like they're constantly searching, they're constantly trying to figure things out on their own. But in Christianity, there's kind of just this surrender, this like surrender to a higher power, this surrender, this faith that like everything will go okay and God has a plan for you. And you might not know exactly entirely what that plan is, but it will unfold and you will start to see what it is over time, right? So I think like that's another thing too that I think um is something that's deeper. It's a deeper spiritual truth that is not just stuck in the material, like egoic way of living, which is like I have it all figured out. I'm gonna get what's good for me, and I'm gonna not care about other people in the process. Like Christianity can t entirely flips that on its head. Um, and it kind of says, hey, no, like actually put your faith in something higher, serve others, and don't focus too much on the world, right? I think that's one of the main ideas that Jesus talks about. And this is something I don't think like Christians themselves realize as well. Because just like you have uh Christians who like neglect the body and again not all Christians, but just like you have some Christians who like neglect the body or they're very, very ascetic. you also have people who are on the far end of the spectrum where they're very materialistic and they still consider themselves Christian, and they're very caught in the world and stuff like that, right? And so I think like some Christians don't realize the importance that Christianity places on kind of having it like a semi-ascetic life, which is, maybe you don't have to use the word ascetic. Maybe you could just say simplistic and like more disciplined, but it's not putting so much focus on material possessions and so much focus on uh, you know, like pleasure and gratification. And I think in a sense, it's almost relieving for some people because some people they focus so much on those things that it causes so much suffering because they're constantly chasing those things. And if they don't get them, then they're miserable. And then if they do get them,
That's
then it's not
exactly what I'm
enough.
saying. That's
Yeah,
exactly what
if
I'm
they
saying.
if they do get them,
That's
then
why
it's
I
not
come back
enough.
to the original point is that it works. That's the bottom line is it works. And that's it's like that's the proof in the pudding, you know,
Mhm.
so to speak. But let me I gotta start to wrap it up. So let me we could do a part two if you want, or part two, three, four. Um,
Yeah.
but let me kind of just, I think there's this question of like, is religion good or bad? It's kind of this kind of very obviously simple question, but I was kind of having that framework in my mind is maybe in the title of the podcast, is religion good or bad? And what comes to me is there is a truth, there is a truth. There is one truth, and it's what I would call a mystical truth, which is it's a truth that transcends the mind. It's deeper than the mind. It's deeper than words. It's deeper than ideas. It's deeper than concepts. It's deeper than any um, dualistic expression. So it's a truth that cannot be expressed in words, but there is this truth at the heart of all creation. And one way of using words would be to say that truth is at the heart of all creation is God. And um, if we live in alignment with that truth, if we live in alignment with God and God's will, then there's a sense of sustainable fulfillment and well-being. And that's not even a strong enough term. It's like this kind of like just immense, infinite love that we realize that is the heart and the essence of who we really are and the essence of the universe itself. Okay, so if we realize that truth and that truth is what we're devoted to, then religion can be a secondary expression of the rituals, the sacraments, the communal events can be a secondary expression of that truth and can support us in community to be deepening in that truth. Um,
Mhm.
However, if that truth is not at the essence of our lives, it's not what we're devoted to, then the rituals, the sacraments, the community events are not helpful and can actually even be a distraction and a deterrent from being in community with that truth. So I think that's the key component to whether religion is quote good or bad. Obviously, there's a simplistic terms, but
I
uh,
think I think an important thing to recognize is your spiritual, because like I think religion provides external, I don't even know what the term would be, but it provides these like external constraints sort of in some ways. I think it also
yeah, sure,
encourages people to do things as well.
right,
Um, but I also think that if your relationship with God is not coming from an internal place and it's coming from some
right,
sort of external forced place, then that is not true spirituality. And I think that religion is kind of an expression of spirituality. Like it's an expression of true spirituality. Now, of course, because it's an expression, it can be corrupted, right? It's like somebody who's like painting art or something, right? Somebody who's making a song, right? Like there's this expression that wants to come through them, and that expression can get corrupted, right? Like somebody can be like, "Hey, I know you have this really creative song you want to make," and this is something I relate to as like a musician as well. But like, so it was like, "Oh, I know this really creative song you want to make, but actually, I think you should use these lyrics, or I think you should." try to make the bass sound like this or try to put this drum beat instead, right? And it's so like you get kind of constrained by these like external things and that can be kind of manipulated. And I think instead you have to see it as like, religion is kind of like the canvas or like the instruments, right? That like this internal expression of spirituality is being manifested in the world. And that's why in religion, you see things like community where people come together and they worship together and they sing hymns together and they do sacraments and rituals together, right? And so I think, again, like it's something that can be religion can be easily corrupted, but spirituality will always be something that is true and innate. And it's simply a matter of channeling that. I think people channel that in different ways. But I think that a lot of the people who end up getting hurt from religion or they end up getting, church hurt or whatever, a lot of them usually are dealing with aspects of religion that have been twisted and that have been kind of manipulated into a human thing, something that's human or it takes it moves away from the actual divine essence of what is at the heart of a relationship with God, which is love, right? And again, it's not just love for um, yourself, but it's also love for others. And that love is rooted in God because I think a lot of people, and this is also something I see in the New Age or the loose spiritual community. It's always like, oh, I have to love myself, right? It's always like, let me like say all these affirmations in the mirror. Let me like do all these things to love myself. But it's such a relief when you can just be like, no, like God loves me, like obviously, yeah, you can love yourself too, but like when you can just be relieved of the sense that God loves you unconditionally, it's such a relief because now you don't have to try to do all these things to try to love yourself. Like you're already loved. You've been loved since you were born, you've been loved before you're born, and you will be loved after you're born. And I think when people like come to that realization, it's extremely transformational because I think that's the one of the issues with atheism and maybe some of the spiritual community is that I think in Christianity there's this relational element that is so kind of rooted in humanity, right? Because like so much of who human beings are is based on relationships. And when you have this relationship, right, with like Jesus, who was somebody that you can, because it's kind of hard to relate to like God as like this like mystical, like esoteric, like people debate whether whether God's like masculine or feminine. It's like it's this very like kind of distant source, right? That's kind of harder to relate to. But I think like Jesus who came and he was kind of like God in the flesh, or he was human and divine. I think when people have that sort of relationship with somebody that actually like lived on the planet and did these different things and kind of like had the element like the spirit of God and was living in a divine way, when you have a relationship with that figure, that is something that is very unique. And that is something that I think can kind of uh, allows people to channel love and to channel a way of living in a way that other things cannot do. Because again, like I think a lot of people believe in God, but they might not necessarily know what God intends for them or how God intends for them to live or they might not have an example of how they should live, And I think that's the ele that's one unique element that I think Christianity brings. Um, but again, I also think too that, there are aspects of religion that can be corrupted and that can lead people to a lot of pain, a lot of hurt, a lot of mistrust. And it's a very unfortunate thing. But I don't think that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater and say all religion is bad, or that I think there's things that we need to really dive into and see, like are there things in the modern world on a large scale that we're missing and that can be found within religion, that can be found within uh aspects of spirituality that are more grounded. I think it's a really an important question that a lot of people need to ask themselves because obviously as a society there's a lot of shifts going on. And as you were saying earlier, like there's this kind of move to the sort of masculine, right? Um and I think that with all these shifts, it's a time where people really need to reflect and really need to like look at their lives, look at and this is something I've done. So I'm not saying this just for people to, I'm not just saying this like and pulling it out of my butt, right? Like I'm actually really, really meaning this when I'm saying it. Um, I think a lot of people need to like reflect and to look at the decisions that they made in the past, to look at the ideologies that they had in the past, to look at the ways that other people are living. And maybe there's examples in the world of ways that people are living that you can actually take for yourself and say, hey, like maybe there is a higher way of living, right, that I'm not doing, right? And I think that's where the humility comes in to actually open yourself up, right? Because I've heard this from a lot of Christians too. Like they say, like, ask God to reveal himself to you. It's not a thing of like, I'm going to try to create God with uh my own ideas and my own like concepts, whatever. You have to surrender. There's a sense of surrender. There's a sense of humility, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people like really need to dive into on their own spiritual journey is allowing themselves to open up to something that might be greater, to something that might give them a deeper sense of purpose, it's deeper sense of meaning, a sense of guidance, a sense of morality, a sense of wholeness and community, right? All these things that I think a lot of aspects of religion and aspects of Christianity can provide for people. I think that's something that a lot of people need to explore.
Love you, son.
Love you too.